community, as well as our Congress, that specifically go to the idea of basically a commerce-only internet. And you're not allowed to embed videos, you're not allowed to discuss things that were copyrighted by someone else. So it shuts down the idea of discussion boards, all of this kind of thing. And it's been really hammered out in detail at the E8. Instead of the G8, this is the E8, because these are all of the IT guys that were dragged along with the politicos this last 4 times. And they've got it down to a fairly nice control grid that they think that they can implement. And there's even a plan to start in some of their economic powerhouses like Germany. And there's even a corresponding plan on how they would attempt to implement it here in the United States. But the effect would be a creeping level of censorship such that all of our source goes away in the form of all of the discussion boards, etc., basically at the same time as all of the research, or however you want to characterize it, truth movements, woo-woo, woo-jo, whatever kinds of sites are clamped down on and made to pony up with licenses and thus toe the government line or not. And so that's the kindest, gentlest form of explanation for what started as a data holes and gets to a data hard stop. And it makes sense with the timeline of how long it takes government to exercise this kind of stuff. It makes sense that with the timeline of the government now discussing the idea, they don't ever discuss in public anything that they haven't already agreed upon, bear in mind. So the mere fact that they're discussing it says they are in fact doing it. It's not a hypothetical, it's not a maybe. It is just how they're introducing the idea to you, that they're going to preserve your commercial rights, but they're going to cut down on all of this terribleness of all of the spam and the viruses and all of this sort of thing with the new and improved internet. And you'll like it a lot better, so don't worry. Now, there's that. Then we've also found this huge increase in, and by huge I mean 3-fold, maybe 4-fold increase in immediacy data relative to longer-term data. That can be explained also by a censorship approach that may be being exercised. So follow me here. If one had gained an understanding, as I have, of the emotional attachment in terms of time to linguistics, then one could relatively easily write a series of programs that could be used to scrub specific language types from discussions in other easily accessible areas based on their temporal duration values. And there's some evidence, Igor here thinks he's found some evidence, and he's in the process of writing a script that may prove this, but he's got his own issues with his wife's health and so on, so we won't have any definitive results for a while, if ever. But he's attempting to validate his premise that indeed there's some mega scrubbing going on, and that it's a deliberate attempt to whittle us down, so to speak. He's paranoid at a level I'm not. That would take a huge amount of programming effort, and I don't know that they would go to that trouble just to bully on us when we're so easily bullied other ways that don't cost very much, which they do all the time. So I don't buy that until he can prove it, but nonetheless, it's possible. Now, he's looking at that shift in the data from one viewpoint, and I'm looking at it from another. And one of the things I think I may be seeing is a shift in the data towards a dampening down, as I've said, of the willingness to know, the desire, the attachment of an emotional, I wish this, to the idea of knowledge that seem to be almost palpable within the sheeple as recently as 4 months ago, and is now maybe half that level in emotional intensity. Though the newness of the shift into the immediacy values, the reduction of the longer-term value sets over time, because we've been experiencing this over the last year, and some of the alterations in the language suggest that there is something definitively happening related to what we'd called the data gap and we now see as the hard stop. But specifically what it is, I don't know. But at least that explanation would allow us to survive beyond 2013 without being scrubbed off by a giant solar flare.
But Cliff, sorry, the willingness to know I can understand, but in regards to a new internet too, where only certain people would have access, I mean, people would still be viewing the new Internet 2 version, so they would still have psychic leaks past the data gap and have legal language, even though it was restricted. So, I mean, that's pretty hard to imagine that would be the data.
No, it doesn't quite work that way. People would indeed be able to see, because people are psychic, they would know that this level of fascism is coming. And how would they express that in their language? They may express it at a level where imagine, let me put it to you this way, in a broad metaphorically archetype. If we all as a super consciousness, expressing as individual consciousness, are aware that there's a big giant looming space goat fart, fascism, whatever, coming our way, we may express that knowledge not in the language itself, but in a lack of the language. Ones and zeros, right? And so just because we've been using ones, somethings, doesn't necessarily preclude us from not using nothings. Make sense? So in other words, the holes that we're seeing in the data for some period of years may have been how we express the idea that the ability to communicate at this level is going to go away because of government fiat.
Okay. Just one quick thing. If it isn't the internet being changed.
Right.
Previously in a GLP interview, you mentioned that prior to the data gap in March 2012, you saw some spikes in some data sets. I think one was the sun disease. Do you see any spikes prior to the March 2012 data gap hard stop that might indicate what it is?
We don't have any change in those. That's the problem. So the last time we looked at those, which was the beginning of this year in January, when we had we're going through the gigantic Terra entity that was in that, was focused for that report, and we looked at the sun disease. We still have huge spikes of those occurring all through this year, and then a very large ramp up through to March of 2013. So while the level of values have changed, the overall proportions within those values relative to the other values and the lack of any other data has not. So the structure of the holes didn't change. We didn't get any more data in between the holes that was in any way different within that run since January and through into this last one, which was eaten up in the malware. So sorry to say, no. The prognosis is if it's not the internet, then it's going to be giant solar flares, and that still is what we keep seeing in the powers that be entity as their primary driving fear. And it always, again, I was always puzzled by the actions of the powers that be relative to the memes of the fear that supposedly was driving them, as that fear had been repeated in the Wuzhou. So it was always that, oh, well, the powers that be are deathly afraid of a giant cataclysm in 2012, and that's why they're going underground. Makes sense. But not if that cataclysm is a crustal shift. Because they would certainly know that anything underground is going to be ground into salt and pepper. And so they wouldn't go underground. The fact that they were building underground kind of meant that it wasn't a crustal shift, but I could never see the mechanism. Once I saw the mechanism, it made a lot of sense. The expanding Earth doesn't require that you have a crustal shift in order to cause damage on the surface, and it would be safe in certain areas underground, those areas that had yet to fracture, unless you were looking at an expansion event beyond anything that we could understand, in which case the Earth may become so large in that kind of an expansion event that nothing over the size of a mouse could exist, for instance, because you couldn't pump blood to your brain. In terms of, we don't know how large these expansion events are. We don't know how rapidly it was that the dinosaurs were killed by their own anatomy relative to that, and how we all shrank down to our current size. But a large enough expansion theoretically could cause this. But anyway, the powers that be are there, digging underground. We have evidence for this. The minions are heavily involved in it. There's a whole huge industry involved. It's been sucking cement for years, and it made no sense. But it does now. And that would be because it would be great against solar flares for brief periods where you had to retreat and then you could come out, and then you had to retreat and then you could come on out. It doesn't do very much good for those of us that can't retreat, though. That is another explanation for the data gap, because it would maybe affect populations in a holing fashion, if you will. Rather than irradiate the whole population of the planet at a time, it may be bursts, and so getting through the holes in the magnetosphere and causing the population reduction by way of punching in a metaphor. And so you'd take a sheet of paper and reduce it down to nothing by punching out little dots, in essence, and that would certainly fit the pattern of the lack of data we've got. Either explanation still stands. We just don't know for sure. The puzzlement for us has been the rapid growth in immediacy data.
Okay, Lua, you've got a follow-up question about the data gap?
I certainly do. My question is in regards to the data death. Do you still see any data coming in from 2015 to 2017, or from 2040 to 2041? Or did the data for then go poof when you tweaked the lexicon?
It went poof.
It went poof.
Yes, there was. That's why I'm calling it a hard stop now, is because that past the May, I want to say 13th, but I think it was May 21 of 2013. There just is no data. So our earlier view of this had been the following. Here we are looking at an aquarium that's filled with millions of really rapidly moving, very attractive tropical fish, but we can't see them all. We're looking through a little tiny pinhole. If we move our pinhole further out, we can see more of what's going on, but we of course lose clarity as we do so because our focal length is constrained by the pinhole. Now, here we are moving the aquarium along, all the fishes are swimming, and all of a sudden we start seeing little black areas where all of a sudden the fish that used to be there isn't there. And then by the time we get to the point in 2013, earlier, it had been as though there was an area in which no fish would swim, like a deoxygenated layer of water that was vertical within the aquarium. There just was nothing there. But on the other side, there were a few of these brightly moving little dots. That no longer exists. We no longer have the brightly moving dots on the other side. It is as though, I know for a fact how we do the processing. The tweaking the lexicon removed that as an artifact of programming, and that had always been an artifact of programming.
I'm really having a hard time with my imagination level here. If there is absolutely no data gap at all, I'm having a real hard time with figuring out how there can be people. How is anything but annihilation?
It may indeed be that way. I have no way of discerning at this stage that there is anything beyond annihilation. But there are other explanations for why our system would report it this way that don't include annihilation. But it's also very feasible to suspect that this is a species extinction level event, and especially since there's evidence that we're in a giant extinction level event for other species at the moment. So it indeed is still a valid explanation.
Is it possible that we could be talking about a high percentage without absolute annihilation and still have a complete loss of data?
Sure. Because our level of granularity has never been 1-for-1 or any of that kind of thing, so we've always been aggregating. And again, the universe favors this. The data that we have now in the form of ancient records in a number of languages, where we can get specific references to previous cataclysms, have suggested that this very last one, 13,000 years ago, was a real terrible one, and very few of us came through. Maybe as few as 10,000 breeding pairs. And but nonetheless, universe favored us, and that small amount did come through. Whereas previous times, especially on the now can't find it anymore Narmer plate, it discussed some of the previous times where, hey, it wasn't a big deal, okay, a third of the population died and we got the crap kicked out of us and all the houses had to be rebuilt, but we're good to go,
Well, I want to thank you for that. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say that question, the original one, came from Diane VG from the forum.
Oh, okay.
And